Prince William purposefully walked into a dusty, historic estate office at exactly 8:46 in the morning, flanked by two stone-faced solicitors carrying identical black briefcases, and systematically, completely dismantled years of confident assumptions held by Queen Camilla's extended family, all without raising his voice a single octave. The truly fascinating part of this encounter isn't just the cold confrontation itself. It's the undeniable fact that the impenetrable legal trap he utilized to crush them was actively built long before Camilla was ever officially married to Charles, literally years beforehand. That is exactly where this entire story gets genuinely, incredibly weird and revealing. Because if the documented timeline is perfectly accurate, then someone highly placed in the royal family clearly saw this exact bitter property fight coming from a mile away, and quietly, ruthlessly ensured it would only ever end one specific way. Before we dive deep into the granular details, if you genuinely enjoy these exhaustive deep dives into royal family power struggles and the archaic legal machinery that silently dictates them, please hit subscribe to my channel. We meticulously break down the exact stories the palace PR machine would strongly prefer to keep quiet. Okay, let's talk about the estate in question, Ravensmere. The story officially begins with a tense meeting that was absolutely not supposed to be a legal meeting at all. William absolutely didn't arrive with a flashy police motorcade or a coordinated public announcement to the press. He simply pulled quietly through the massive eastern gates in a dark, unassuming vehicle, stepped out onto the wet gravel, and deliberately walked entirely around the side of the historic manor house instead of utilizing the grand main entrance. That is a highly calculated choice. He deliberately avoided the imposing grand staircase, the comfortable, formal drawing room where his family waited, the warm fireplaces, absolutely all of it. He walked straight to the old, drafty estate office, the specific, cold room where original land records have been meticulously stored since Queen Victoria's reign. That is absolutely not where you go for a casual, warm family chat over morning tea. That is exactly where you go when you desperately want the physical room itself to coldly remind everyone present that this discussion is strictly about hard legal reality. Absolutely not. Personal feelings or royal status. By 9:05 a.m., Camilla had been casually informed by staff that William was physically inside the house, and she didn't think much of it initially. She naturally assumed he was simply there to politely discuss some ongoing renovations. Ravensmere genuinely needed significant, expensive repairs. Two ancient, massive lead roofs were currently leaking badly, actively threatening highly valuable, historic plasterwork inside. There had been many quiet, ongoing family discussions about extensively converting some outer, unused cottages specifically for her extended family's future use. King Charles had privately, enthusiastically supported the expensive idea, though absolutely not formally or legally. That massive distinction matters a great deal later in the morning. Camilla's family had arrived eagerly, expecting a smooth, pleasant meeting, perhaps just a few quick signatures on standard, boring household paperwork to get the builders started. They confidently believed the massive estate had been essentially settled for their use for nearly 15 long years. And honestly, why wouldn't they? Ravensmere is a truly massive, staggering property. 12,000 sprawling acres of prime land, a gigantic, historic Jacobean manor house, 42 individual cottages, 2 fully operational working farms, a serene private lake, and a collection of rare, priceless paintings that are absolutely not listed in any public royal inventory. The deferential estate staff had even started routinely calling a bright, sunlit upstairs room Mr. Parker Bowles's study. Fresh, expensive flowers were meticulously placed in that specific room that very morning. Highly paid architects had already drawn up extensive, detailed renovation plans. Antique, valuable furniture was being actively measured to ensure it would fit smoothly through the historic doorways. One prominent relative even openly talked about permanently moving highly expensive horses to the expansive southern paddocks. Camilla's own son got a highly detailed tour of the massive underground wine cellar and explicitly learned exactly which rare vintage bottles legally belonged to the house collection and which he could drink freely when he visited. Imagine comfortably hearing that level of deference for 15 years. Imagine truly feeling like the confirmed future owner every single time you confidently drive through those massive iron gates. Then, Prince William walks in, silently places a dense 6-page legal opinion directly on the wooden table, and coldly says, "None of you were ever beneficiaries." That single, devastating sentence instantly changes the entire morning. It also violently changes the entire past 15 years, because suddenly every single warm promise Charles ever made sounds completely different and utterly empty. Every expensive renovation plan suddenly looks highly questionable. Every specific room they confidently thought of as their own actually, legally belonged to someone else entirely, but exactly who? That was the immediate, burning question in the room, and William completely refused to answer it immediately. He simply, coldly said, "Not yet." Camilla finally entered the cold estate office shortly after 9:20 a.m. Charles followed a few tense minutes later, looking visibly, intensely irritated by the sudden disruption. His jaw was noticeably tight. He was clearly furious that this serious issue hadn't been discussed with him entirely privately first. As the reigning king, he naturally expected a certain high level of deference from his son. William absolutely didn't even stand up when his father entered the room. He stayed firmly seated beside his lead solicitor, looking relaxed but highly guarded, with one hand resting protectively on a faded leather folder. Charles looked down at that specific folder and instantly recognized the faded gold crest stamped on it. It explicitly belonged to his grandmother, the revered Queen Mother, and according to the story from insiders present, the color completely drained right out of the king's face. Here is the absolute core, legal truth about Ravensmere that changes everything. Charles absolutely didn't buy the estate with his own money. He didn't formally receive it as a gift from the British state. It absolutely wasn't standard Crown estate property managed by the government. It was entirely part of a highly private, fiercely protected family settlement, a massive trust created decades ago by a generation of royals who intimately understood exactly how to legally protect generational wealth from outsiders. That specific settlement had been legally, meticulously amended exactly 3 times over the decades. The first major change strictly prevented the valuable agricultural land from ever being sold off. The Second Amendment strongly protected the historic manor house from having its priceless assets stripped and sold. The third most crucial change protected the absolute one thing absolutely nobody else in the room had ever bothered to legally check: the strict succession clause, determining exactly who inherits next. Charles legally possessed exactly what trust lawyers refer to as a life interest. This simply meant he could legally use Ravensmere, he could maintain it, and he could receive the lucrative annual income generated from the 2 working farms, but he fundamentally, legally, could absolutely not transfer ownership of the property to absolutely anyone outside the specific family bloodline explicitly named in the original settlement documents. Not by a heartfelt verbal promise, not by a handwritten letter of intent, and absolutely not even by a direct royal command. The King of the United Kingdom absolutely could not give away this specific house. Camilla's daughter reportedly asked the most obvious logical question in the room: if His Majesty completely controls the massive estate during his lifetime, exactly why can't he simply choose exactly what happens to it immediately after he dies? One of William's solicitors silently opened the faded leather folder. The crisp sound of crinkling, aged paper was incredibly loud in the dead quiet room. The legal answer was devastatingly simple, because that specific choice was legally, permanently taken away from him long before his second marriage ever occurred. There was absolute, stunned silence. This massive legal decision was explicitly made before the royal wedding, absolutely not after it. Someone highly intelligent anticipated this exact, messy family fight many years before absolutely anyone else did. Everyone naturally expected William to say Queen Elizabeth II's name as the architect of the trap. He absolutely didn't. The ironclad legal amendment was officially signed and heavily notarized in late 1999, exactly 3 years before the Queen Mother passed away, and exactly 6 long years before Charles officially married Camilla in 2005. Next to the Queen Mother's shaky age signature was another incredibly bold, recognizable signature, Princess Margaret's. Now, the atmosphere in the tiny room wasn't just legally tense. It felt incredibly, deeply personal. Princess Margaret was officially one of the original founding trustees of the massive estate. She was historically known for having incredibly sharp eyes and a deep, abiding suspicion of ambitious outsiders entering the family. Declassified documents now available clearly show she raised a highly serious, specific concern. At a formal trust meeting, she explicitly stated she was deeply worried that Ravensmere could eventually end up legally belonging to a completely new family through a future, unforeseen marriage that was absolutely not approved by the original settler of the trust. She absolutely didn't need to mention anyone by name. She absolutely didn't have to. The incredibly harsh legal wording she fiercely demanded left absolutely zero room for doubt or creative interpretation. The solicitor read it out completely flatly to the stunned room. No spouse, no child of a spouse, nor any descendant unrelated by direct blood to King George VI shall ever gain permanent title, controlling interest, or beneficial ownership of this estate. Camilla's children absolutely weren't named specifically, but that actually made the exclusion infinitely worse. They were entirely, legally excluded as a mere concept long before they even knew the massive estate existed. Charles leaned aggressively toward the solicitor, looking visibly, intensely angry. "I was never told about this specific clause," he stated. William looked up and stared directly, unblinkingly at his father. "You signed a sworn acknowledgement of it." The solicitor seamlessly slid a crisp photocopy across the wooden table, clearly showing Charles's own distinctive signature at the very bottom, clearly dated November 1999. Suddenly, something felt incredibly off in the room. If Charles had actually signed this legally binding document, exactly how could he possibly genuinely believe Ravensmere could ever legally go to Camilla's family? Exactly how could he have confidently made all those expensive promises for 15 years? Charles slowly picked up the paper, his hands shaking slightly. He turned it over, stared at the date, then looked back at William. For several painful, agonizing seconds, he had absolutely no response. His own past signature had completely trapped him. The solicitor politely cleared his throat and carefully explained that the specific acknowledgement signature was buried incredibly deep inside a highly complex, 100-page financial restructuring plan involving 6 entirely different royal properties. Ravensmere was only explicitly mentioned exactly twice in the entire dense document. Once by its highly obscure, dry legal parcel number, and once by an incredibly old estate name the family absolutely hadn't used in casual conversation since 1936. Charles may very well have signed the massive stack of paperwork entirely without truly understanding the full, devastating legal meaning of the buried clause, or, significantly worse, he might have known exactly what it meant at the time and simply, arrogantly thought he could easily use his power to change it later when he was king. However, there was another massive insurmountable problem for them. The ironclad clause absolutely could technically be changed, and that's exactly what Camilla's scrambling legal team and her shocked family had desperately hoped for all along. All Charles needed to legally change it was the surviving estate trustee's explicit written consent. But there was currently only one single trustee left alive whose approval legally mattered: Prince William. Now you clearly see exactly why William held the antique keys. Charles felt completely, utterly trapped. Months earlier, the king had actually tried to solve this exact problem by approaching William highly indirectly. A deeply trusted palace aide had sent William a highly confidential, complex proposal. The lengthy document described a new plan for Ravensmere, smoothly calling it a necessary continuity arrangement. Continuity sounds incredibly harmless and administrative. It is an absolutely perfect, sanitized word for legally making a quiet, messy, private promise completely permanent. William carefully read the dense proposal and asked exactly one piercing question. Exactly who gets the ultimate legal benefit of the estate? The aide responded hesitantly 2 days later. A brand new family trust would be legally created to specifically benefit Camilla's children and grandchildren. William ruthlessly rejected it instantly, absolutely without offering any negotiation or an alternative compromise. He simply returned the thick document with the word "rejected" scrawled in thick black ink. But Charles absolutely didn't give up his effort. He quickly sent a significantly more complex, sophisticated legal plan specifically designed to hide the transfer of wealth. In this second plan, Camilla's family wouldn't actually own Ravensmere directly on paper, which would obviously break the strict bloodline rule. Instead, they would cleverly get an ironclad 99-year lease for a purely symbolic rent of exactly £1 per year. The royal family would technically, legally still own the massive estate on paper. In stark reality, William and his direct descendants would be completely, legally locked out of using it for an entire century. It was incredibly clever, almost clever enough to actually work. But the brilliant Queen Mother had perfectly anticipated this exact, sneaky trick decades ago. Hidden deep in the original trust paperwork was another, lethal trap. Absolutely any lease extending longer than 21 years legally required explicit, written approval from absolutely all living trustees. William flatly rejected the second proposal too. That theoretically should have completely ended the hidden bureaucratic conflict. It didn't. Exactly 3 weeks later, private construction contractors unexpectedly arrived at Ravensmere. They absolutely weren't there for emergency repairs to the leaking roof. They came to conduct a highly detailed, incredibly expensive residential survey. They meticulously measured the crumbling west wing. They closely inspected the historic kitchens for massive, modern upgrades. They actively assessed whether the old, historic nursery corridor could be entirely converted into sprawling, luxury family apartments. Absolutely nobody informed Prince William. They clearly thought he simply wouldn't notice the activity. But William actively noticed something highly unusual in the estate maintenance accounts he oversees. A massive invoice for an architectural survey totaling exactly $18,400 was quietly, sneakily hidden among completely routine expenses for minor roof repairs and standard agricultural work. The highly specific description on the invoice caught his sharp attention immediately: future occupancy adaptation and spatial planning. He naturally wondered exactly who would be occupying the massive space in the future. He immediately requested absolutely all recent invoices, receipts, and work orders related to Ravensmere. After days of exhaustive searching, he found a huge, undeniably clear order for custom-built, highly expensive furniture, intricate mahogany shelving, a fully temperature-controlled wine tasting room, and 2 luxurious bathrooms specifically designed for full-time residents. The specific delivery paperwork listed Parker Bowles as the sole authorized recipient, absolutely not King Charles or Queen Camilla. Back in the cold estate office, Camilla desperately argued that absolutely no one had actually tried to take anything legally yet. She weakly claimed the expensive surveys were just preliminary planning, and the custom furniture hadn't actually been physically installed yet. She firmly reminded William that absolutely no formal lease had been signed by anyone. All technically, legally true, but William's real underlying concern was definitively proving they had actively, expensively prepared to inherit something they knew they weren't legally entitled to. Camilla's son pushed a folder away angrily, insisting loudly they only acted on direct, solid assurances from the king. William replied incredibly quietly, his voice cutting through the anger. Assurances are absolutely not legal ownership. Everyone sitting in the tense room intimately knew the ultimate source of those empty assurances was King Charles. Charles turned to William in sheer anger, loudly stating the messy situation could have easily remained completely private. William coldly responded, it was entirely private until illegal trust funds were actively used for this. That's a critical point. Royal families can skillfully manage and spin public scandals, but hard financial records brutally expose the unvarnished truth. William legally had to challenge the illicit spending as part of his strict fiduciary responsibilities as a trustee. Seeing William's absolute, unshakable determination, Camilla suddenly realized this massive problem was infinitely larger than just losing Ravensmere. Highly similar, restrictive rules govern many other massive royal properties. If William was perfectly willing to aggressively investigate this one specific case, exactly what else might he eventually uncover in the archives? That terrifying thought instantly shifted her approach. She abruptly stopped arguing about legal rights and custom furniture and asked a highly vital strategic question. If we are legally barred from this estate, exactly who will inherit it instead? William absolutely didn't answer her directly. He just silently signaled to the solicitor to continue reading. The solicitor slowly turned to the 4th page of the document and read aloud so absolutely everyone in the quiet room could clearly hear. When King Charles eventually dies, Charles's life interest will immediately end. The entire Ravensmere estate will then legally go to the next eligible beneficiary, explicitly chosen by the active trustees. Camilla's daughter interrupted the reading, sounding visibly relieved by the text. Well, that's obviously William. He's the direct heir. It completely made logical sense, but just 9 days earlier, William had quietly, legally, and permanently given up his entire claim to the massive estate. Absolutely nobody in the room knew he had done this. Not Charles, not Camilla, not even the most senior palace advisors. Why on earth would William fight so incredibly hard to keep total control of the estate, but then flatly refuse to inherit it himself? Because he absolutely didn't want the massive house or the endless financial trouble of fixing its ancient, leaking roofs. He just fiercely wanted to completely control exactly what happened to it and ensure it absolutely didn't fall into the wrong hands. By formally renouncing his massive claim, he instantly activated a little-known, highly obscure contingency clause that had been completely inactive for 27 years. The estate would automatically go to the next royal sibling explicitly mentioned in the Queen Mother's original 1999 amendment. Everyone in the room was incredibly tense. Prince Harry? No, Harry's name absolutely wasn't anywhere in the document. He was bypassed entirely. Princess Anne? Yes, she was explicitly named, but she had also completely given up her legal claim in a sealed declaration to the trust years ago. She simply didn't want the massive responsibility. That left absolutely only one single person in the entire royal family, Prince Andrew. King Charles worried intensely for a terrifying moment. Giving the massive estate to the disgraced Andrew would cause an absolute, unmitigated public relations nightmare. Then the solicitor slowly turned the last page. Andrew had been completely, legally ruled out because of a strict, unyielding rule triggered by his formal decision to step back from active royal duties. So exactly who was left? Prince Edward. At that exact moment, Camilla's son leaned in closely and said, in disbelief, "Read that again." The solicitor repeated it confidently and clearly. Prince Edward, the quiet Duke of Edinburgh, would be the absolute new, legal owner of the entire Ravensmere estate. But that absolutely wasn't the end of the devastating surprises. Edward had intimately known about this for weeks, thanks to a private heads-up from William. He quietly, humbly accepted the massive inheritance completely, without any public celebrations or media attention. Instead, he added exactly one strict, unshakable condition to his legal acceptance. Ravensmere would absolutely not be his luxurious private home. Instead, its lucrative farms, its numerous cottages, and absolutely all of its annual income would go directly into a brand new charity. This specific charity would fiercely help wounded military veterans, financially support bereaved military families, and provide essential shelter for vulnerable young people aging out of the foster care system. The Grand Manor House itself would entirely become a peaceful, fully funded home for the struggling families of active service members receiving long-term, specialized medical treatment. Edward inherited the massive estate, but then immediately, legally gave away absolutely everything it could ever earn for him. This incredibly selfless act completely shocked absolutely everyone in the room. Camilla's family absolutely didn't just lose Ravensmere to a powerful future king. They completely lost it to a humble, quiet man who deliberately chose not to treat it as personal, luxurious property. King Charles sat completely frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the final proposal resting on the table. He had privately, repeatedly promised a massive estate to part of his new family. Now, that exact estate would forever proudly carry his younger brother's name through a massive charity. Each and every beautifully restored veteran's cottage on the property would permanently, publicly show that Charles's private royal promises meant absolutely nothing. Every single struggling military family warmly welcomed through those iron gates would constantly remind everyone that Edward selflessly turned a huge royal inheritance into a massive public service, while absolutely others were busy selfishly planning luxury upgrades for themselves. William slowly slid 3 antique brass keys across the heavy wooden table. He absolutely didn't give them to Camilla. He handed them directly to Prince Edward's waiting solicitor. The absolute heaviest key opened the massive archive room. The second key opened the Grand Manor's heavy front doors. The smallest key opened a small, historic chapel located quietly on the estate. Edward had only ever visited the small chapel once, as a young boy with his beloved grandmother. The newly signed trust agreement explicitly stated this small chapel would be the absolute only part of the sprawling 12,000-acre Ravensmere estate entirely reserved for his family, absolutely not for living or vacationing, but solely as a quiet place to remember her. Charles finally spoke up, his voice incredibly weak and defeated. "You arranged absolutely all of this without telling me," William replied incredibly gently. "Absolutely not, as if he had just won a massive battle. You had already made your own arrangements, father." That is the ultimate profound humiliation for King Charles. Neither a massive public uprising nor the vicious tabloid press defeated him. Instead, he was incredibly quietly beaten by his own administrative mistakes. A forgotten careless signature from 1999 and massive empty promises he simply couldn't legally keep completely trapped him. He was entirely outsmarted by his younger brother, who took the massive estate and instantly made it incredibly valuable for others. Camilla, still deeply shocked and reeling, asked quietly, "What exactly happens to the rooms we already prepared, the ones we paid for?" The head solicitor closed the heavy folder incredibly slowly, a deliberate sound that clearly signaled absolute finality. "They will go directly back to the original estate inventory. The expensive, custom shelving would be entirely removed. The Parker Bowles's private study name would permanently disappear from all staff conversations. The massive wine collection would remain securely locked away, unavailable to them. Even the fresh, hopeful flowers arranged that very morning would be unceremoniously taken out the back door before sunset. By evening, the shiny brass nameplate on the upstairs door was completely unscrewed and discarded. Absolutely no official announcement was ever made from the royal palace. Absolutely no public statement was issued to correct the massive, failed assumptions made by Camilla's family. Casual visitors driving past the grand gate saw absolutely nothing unusual. Inside the manor, however, exactly one incredibly important thing changed. The 3 antique brass keys absolutely no longer hung beneath King Charles's imposing portrait in the grand hallway. They were now resting in a simple, unadorned wooden box placed squarely beside a faded photo of the Queen Mother. On top of the keys rested a small, handwritten note from Prince Edward with exactly 7 powerful words: "Let this house belong to those who need it." So, who really won that freezing cold morning? Was it William, who brilliantly set the impenetrable legal trap? Was it Edward, who quietly took and then immediately, selflessly gave away the massive estate? Or was it the incredibly clever, intensely cautious woman who brilliantly, ruthlessly locked absolutely everything away back in 1999? The palace mistakenly thought they were just aggressively arguing over a luxurious country house. But the final, small key unlocked something significantly more important: the brutal truth that in this highly complex family, grand promises mean absolutely nothing unless they are explicitly written down, legally signed, and fiercely protected by someone who deeply understood exactly how the next ambitious generation would inevitably try to break them.